Либо-либо.
Последний месяц разворачивался скандал вокруг 57-й московской школы. Эта школа считается одной из лучших в стране.
On August 29, 2016, Russian state television broadcast a story about a scandal at one of Moscow's most prestigious schools. The news report cited a Facebook post from a well-known journalist and alumna of the school, Ekaterina Krangaus. She wrote, "For more than 16 years, we knew that the history teacher was having affairs with his students. Quite a handsome guy, smart, ironic, charming. No wonder we fell in love. We were small, but thought we were big. And then the years passed. We became bigger, and his lovers changed and remained small. At some point, I decided to write about this, but the children of my colleagues were studying in the school, and somehow they asked me not to write. And then, even later, I already started writing, and even talked to a girl several years younger than me. But in our editorial office, there were also people whose children studied there. Despite their ardent civic engagement, they also somehow asked me not to write. And now, finally, these people have found the strength to collect evidence. And he doesn't work at the school anymore. And that's good, even though he was a good teacher to everyone who didn't have an affair with him. Because it's not good to sleep with schoolgirls if you're their favorite adult teacher. And it's good that this won't happen at the school anymore." In her post, Ekaterina Krangaus didn't mention the school or teacher's name, but her social circles on Facebook knew exactly where and who she meant. And very quickly, the story was everywhere.
В кадр попадает учитель истории Борис Meerson.
After 26 years of teaching at School 57, allegations against Boris Meerson had become public. From Libo, this is The Adults in the Room. My name is Nastya Krasilnikova. This is episode 5. The storm begins. To understand what led to this post on Facebook, we need to rewind a little. Rebecca Gershovich had graduated from School 57 earlier that year, at the start of the summer.
I graduated, and then I went to work not work, like volunteer, but I was like really there all the time in the Center for Refugee Children. It's a part of Civic Assistance Committee. I was having a lot of panic attacks, and I asked my parents, like, if I could go to a psychologist.
Soon Rebecca found a psychologist and started attending sessions every week.
It was really helpful. It was like something was, I don't know, like I started realizing what happened, and I started realizing that Meerson is not the best person in the world, and like all those things that are happening to my psyche are actually connected to him.
As for Boris Meerson himself,
he wasn't actually keen on continuing with this whole relationship, and I think he realized at some point that I was like getting out of his control and becoming sort of like dangerous to him. And at some point I confronted him about what he did, but like in some mild manner, and he yelled at me and told me to just drop it, and I just decided that I need to do something about it. And then we started talking, Yegor Osipov and I, what we can do with him. And we were like, the first thing we obviously thought about was like, hey, let's contact the journalists we know. And then we were like, but that will be so awful if we contact journalists and it's going to get into the public and everybody is going to discuss it. It's going to be awful for the school and for us. And that was actually a big thing for the school. You know, Meerson was telling me that all the time, that, hey, you can't tell anybody because we're all very progressive and stuff, but people won't understand it. It will be very bad for the school. And I would keep my mouth shut because of that argument.
So Yegor and Rebecca didn't go to journalists. Instead, Rebecca told everything that happened to her at the school to her boss at the Center for the Refugee Children, Olga Nikolaenko. Olga was also a graduate of School 57, and she was shocked by what she had heard.
And she started gathering evidence from all those people, and it was strictly anonymous, and nobody was supposed to know about it.
Olga began gathering evidence with the help of Nadezhda Shapira, who was and still is a literature teacher at School 57. Here is Yegor.
Ola started collecting evidence, and she recorded 14 people who suffered abuse by Boris. And so then on July 28th, I think 2016, Ola Nikolaenko and Nadezhda Shapira went to the school board to demand that they fire Boris. The school board was composed of Sergei Mendelevich, who was the principal, Ekaterina Vishnevetsky, who was his wife, deputy principal, and also my literature teacher, and Boris Davidovich, who was another deputy principal. So Ola and Nadezhda come there and they say, well, we have this evidence, fire the guy. To which Sergei says, this is impossible. He's my best friend. And then Ekaterina says, well, we always thought that Boris had favorites among college student assistants. But then if they accompanied him on class trips, we could be rest assured that nothing inappropriate would happen with the high school students. I mean, it's impossible to wrap your hand around this. You are a principal of a school. Someone comes to you and says, look, a teacher was abusing children. We have evidence of 14 people. And the first thing you say is, no, oh no, what a disaster. Not how I'm sorry. You're not announcing an investigation. You're not interested in the search for the truth. You're not interested in taking care of the victims, not interested in protecting the current students. You say it's impossible. He's my best friend.
But eventually, Ola Nikolaenko and Nadezhda Shapira managed to persuade the school's board to fire Boris Meerson.
So eventually they fired him because something switched in Sergei's mind, and he understood that if he sees the evidence, he will have a different role if this ever comes to criminal prosecution. So he will have seen the evidence and not have acted upon it. So he fired Boris.
Meerson was asked to resign and never came back to Russia.
And he was in Israel at that point, and he just didn't come back. And he had citizenship for a while. So he stayed there and he got fired, and we thought, okay, that's it.
A month had passed since Boris quietly quit his job as a teacher. And then word got out among the School 57 community, which led to that post from Yekaterina Krangaus on Facebook. Suddenly, a story that was meant to be hidden was very, very public. By that time, Rebecca had moved to the United States, where she'd enrolled at the University of California, San Diego.
I had my first summer session at the university, and it was very exciting. And then Katya Krangaus wrote on Facebook that without, everybody knows that part, without mentioning the school, blah, blah, blah. And then there was a ton of people writing about it. And I have no idea how she learned about it. I'm pretty sure somebody might have told her. And I was actually very, very pissed about it because I wasn't ready to do it. And some random third party decided to expose it for some reason, without ever asking any of the people who were victims of this. And I was just reading everything that was going on, and I was just swearing.
While the scandal played out on Facebook, it was also playing out in the school itself.
And so what happens then is that there is a teachers' meeting at the end of August where Nadezhda Shapira stands up and says, well, this happened in our school throughout the summer, which is that Boris was fired. And then the reaction is disproportionate to this, right? The colleagues, they do not believe that. They think that the school board caved into blackmail. And they're also not interested in truth, not interested in investigation, not interested in anything that proper and decent people would be interested in.
I've asked 7 of the school's teachers from that time for an interview. Almost all of them ignored me. And Nadezhda Shapira told me she didn't want to go on record. But there was one teacher who agreed to talk to me. Her name is Natalia Soprunova. She is also a graduate of School 57, and by 2016, she had been a mathematics teacher in the school for 16 years.
That time was incredibly traumatic for me, even though I wasn't a victim or a participant. In fact, I wasn't even involved in the investigation. All that information and horror hit me like a ton of bricks, and my body started reacting. I was scared. I felt repulsed. I stopped missing my School 57 childhood. It was gone. I have the exact same thing with Russia now. The parallel is incredibly clear. And at the first school staff meeting at the end of August, Nadezhda Shapiro made a statement saying that this had happened and that there was all this evidence. And she said it in front of all the teachers. It was very powerful.
And then, 4 days later, there was another staff meeting at the school.
And then, on September 2nd, we had that insane staff meeting, during which 4 of us got up and left, and we handed in our resignations. And then another person joined us. That's 5 people. I'd really only known everything for 4 days before I left the school. The worst part was the way the school reacted. That was truly a nightmare, truly horrifying. This attitude of, well, a good girl wouldn't be sleeping with Meerson. There's something wrong with her. It's just that the kid is shitty. That's a direct quote, if you can believe it.
I asked Natalia, why was it so difficult for school officials to admit that all this was happening and to acknowledge how horrible it was?
One aspect of it was, this was the headmaster's closest friend. Both Meerson and his wife were very close to him. They went on vacations together, spent holidays together. Their families were close. And this closeness, it must have interfered somehow. Because at the staff meeting, things were being said along the lines of, this is my friend, I won't let him down, I will never accept this. So yeah, those things were said, so that must have been one of the reasons. The second reason is more complicated and was discussed at length afterwards. Again, similar to what's happening with Russia right now. Yes, it's bad. Why did he do it? But why should the whole school go down because of this? It's a good school, after all. What now? These things happen? Let's shut this down. Let's not drag the school's good name through the mud again. Let's not ruin its reputation, its prestige. Let's not subject it to this. This narrative was a constant for several years afterward. New headmasters came and went, but this narrative stayed. And they tried not to talk about it if they could help it. I was surprised to have you reach out to me after 7 years. Because in general, well, it wasn't that it was completely swept under the rug, but in general, it was sort of kept under wraps. There was never any acknowledgement given that the school was responsible and that the school was at fault. Never. And that is awful. It'll lead to this happening again. And the same can be said about Russia. I'm sorry I keep drawing this parallel. It's just a through line in my mind.
Natalia is making parallels between the reaction of the school to the scandal and Russians' reaction to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That's something I've thought about a lot. For some people and some countries, it is very difficult to admit their complicity in something so horrible and violent. So they look for explanations. Russian authorities say that the war in Ukraine is some kind of defense against imaginary threats from the West. Similarly, authorities at School 57 seem to view the allegations only as threats to the school's reputation, ignoring the suffering of the survivors. Back to Yegor.
So the few teachers, 5, I think, who say that this is inappropriate and we must investigate this and we must safeguard the existing children somehow, they are being forced to resign. Long story short. There are other teachers are insulting them. They're saying, well, are you saints? What do you think of yourself, etc., etc. And this is all, of course, with active support and participation of the board. The board does the same, right? They want to force those teachers out. Around on that very same day, Rebecca and I write Facebook posts saying that we are actually the children who were abused in this school. So we write those posts not out of free will, but because the public discussion of what's going on has taken on massive proportions. And so by September 1st, the public discussion, if you can call it that way, is already not about the abuse and not about dozens of children who were fucked at the school, but it is about who is guilty in this whole unraveling. Is it the pedosexual who fucked dozens of children and the school board that covered him up? Or is it Katya House who brought that to light? And supposedly smart people are seriously discussing this. They are seriously doing that day after day. And these are, among them, are the very people I thought I would seek help from. This was really unbelievable. The logic of there, of course, was that, okay, there is a pedosexual, but there are many wonderful teachers, and there's such a lovely board, and it's a brilliant institution.
The decision makers in the school at the time were the principal, Sergei Mendelevich, and his wife and deputy, Ekaterina Vishnevetskaya. I repeatedly reached out to them for a comment on this story, but both of them ignored me. But I've talked about their reaction to the accusations with many people. One was Konstantin Sonin, who'd left the school by this time, but was watching closely. You might remember that Sonin is a well-known economist who attended the school and later sent his kids there.
My role was initially just confined to whatever public support I could provide for those who spoke about these things. I participated in different discussions with school officials about the school making a statement, but no statement was ever made.
Can you please tell me more about the reaction of school administration?
I came to School 57 in 1986. It was 2 months before Sergei Mendelevich came to the school. I also know Ekaterina Vishnevetskaya for many, many years. I mean, no question, they badly failed as school administrators. They failed the kids, they failed the parents. The thing is that for many years, School 57 has come under all kinds of pressure. The Soviet authorities tried to close the school. Then, when the school has become popular, there were hundreds of people every year who would try to put their kids into school. So they would send armed bandits. They would send people from the Attorney General office. They would send FSB and police officers to talk to the director to get their kids into the school. So I think in his 30 years at School 57, Sergei Mendelevich developed an extremely thick skin. So basically, when he was resisting a pressure from parents of girls who they thought might have been abused, I think that one part of his thinking was just that I'm not letting go for any pressure. He was resisting basically any pressure. So another circumstance is that Sergei Mendelevich was undergoing a very heavy treatment for cancer at the time for 3 years already. I think this is a very peculiar thing about the way Russian organizations operate. That, like, I cannot imagine a Western organization operating for years under a head who is undergoing a heavy chemotherapy. I'm a cancer survivor myself. I had a chemotherapy experience. And of course, you cannot be reasonably responsible for what you do.
Yeah. And Ekaterina Vishnevetskaya herself, as you told me before, she was referring to her own experience of having a romance with a teacher when she was a schoolgirl. Is that right?
I heard about this at the time. There were a couple of consequential meetings, and in one of these meetings, like the most important one, Vishnevetskaya told a story, what I heard about her romance with Lev Sobolev, who was her history teacher. And basically this was a part of the Meerson's defense, which was, at the time, these girls, they're grown-ups. We treat them as grown-ups. They know what they're doing. They are making their choices. So I think, from what I heard, that Ekaterina Vishnevetskaya was making this case, okay, maybe it was my bad choice, but I was doing this and I survived.
I was so struck by this detail about Ekaterina Vishnevetskaya referring to her experience of having a relationship with her own teacher that I went digging. And several people who were present at that staff meeting have confirmed that she said it. There is a popular saying in Russian, «Я же вырос и ничего». which can be translated as, "Look at me, I grew up and I'm okay." People might use it when they talk about being beaten by their parents as a child. And it's often used against survivors who speak out about their difficult experiences. It's like they're saying, "I also suffered, and look at me now, I'm successful. If you can't get over your childhood, you're weak and immature." I suppose this was the point Ekaterina Vishnevetsky was trying to make. But we will get back to her story later. For now, let's get back to the survivors who were posting online. Here is Rebecca.
And I was reading like all of the stuff that people were writing, and people were accusing us of lying. And then some of the teachers who were supporting us were fired, and everybody was screaming, "Where are those victims? Where are those victims?" And I decided just like at some point, it was like right the day before my first ever final in the university, to write on Facebook that, "Hello, here I am." And I wrote a post. And then it like just started going downhill from there, because everything just devolved. There were articles about how everybody in the school are Jews, or like with Western views, etc., because it also coincides with like this whole propaganda against the elite and the oppositional elite especially, and we're clearly that. People were like finding my most innocent pictures and then posting them with like, "Don't you see she's clearly a whore?" People whom I knew from my childhood, who were like friends of my sister or like friends of my parents, would be like, "I don't think we should believe her. She's clearly a lying, attention-seeking little slut." And like people started sending me letters of like hate from all over the country. And at the same time, I was having a Stockholm syndrome, and I was having like a lot of like unprocessed trauma, and the trauma was coming up at the same time as the like me being like, "Oh no, did I do the wrong thing?" coming up. And at the same time, people telling you that you are a worthless being, and including people whom you know. Like, for instance, I had a brief romance in my gap year after my 11th grade and before I got into the university in the US. And it was just like a nice kind of little thing. And I told him everything about both Mark and Meerson. And he was from also the Sambation crowd. And the guy wrote about me that I should, like, basically a message in poem, in like poetic form, that I should fucking die and that I'm a liar and stuff. And I remember that it hurt. It was really hurtful.
Yegor.
So the crisis showed that it explained to a degree why Boris was able to do what he was doing, because he knew no one in sane mind would report him to the police, because we live in an authoritarian state which oppresses journalists, human rights activists, etc. So you don't go to your enemy, even to report such a serious crime as abuse, right? Abuse is as serious as manslaughter, battery, murder. It is an extremely grave criminal offense, which people often forget, I guess, about. And as a survivor, you torture yourself with all sorts of thoughts about the abuse. You come back to it on and on. You act upon them, also in, self-damaging ways. So abuse plants this seed of self-destruction in you. And then you decide to speak up. You want to get rid of it. You know the abuser is an abhorrent person, and you know that the board was covering him for years, but you hope that the public, including its core of supposedly well-educated people, will be on the right side. But you face something else. A lot of people did believe us, and I'm eternally grateful to them. But unfortunately, even more wanted to protect the school. And there were, I would say, two types of protectors. The first group were just deniers, liars, bullies, friends and relatives of the board, people with completely lacking moral compass, like my classmate who wrote, with quite some followers, right? He wrote a post which basically meant that if I was abused, I deserved it because I caused it upon myself. There were relatives of the board members walking around Facebook, being cynical about everything. But the second group of this so-called let's save the school protectors, it, I think, left more scars on me. So those were the people often with significant social standing in the intelligentsia who formally acknowledged that abusing children is wrong, but focused mostly on protecting the school. And there were many forms of doing that, from expressing direct support to expressing disgust with the scandal instead of expressing disgust with the abuse. So unfortunately, I remember way too many posts and way too many remarks, and this, the intelligent's reaction to this story is probably enough for another podcast.
But we'll get there in this one.
But just to give an example, there was a woman named Viktoria Ivleva, an otherwise very famous Russian human rights defender, photographer, and very decent person with great civic courage. We were not close friends, but I knew her. She helped me get my first journalistic internship as a photographer at Novaya Gazeta. I helped her move apartments once. I was at her house several times. So we knew each other. She wrote a post about what wonderful things were happening in the school besides the affairs between teachers and students, and expressed her support for Sergei Mendelevich and promised, to come to the school the next day, which was the day of when the classes began. And then already after mine and Rivka's revelation, she wrote another post in which she publicly called us traitors. And for us, I assume for Rivka as well, but for me for sure, it triggered all the damaging impulses we were hoped to get rid of. We were sort of told, well, you want to get away from this, you can't. And the justification for it is that, we live in a small society under a strict political regime. You do favors to each other all the time. You build your careers using connections and not skills. And if you want to retain these benefits, you have to share the burdens as well. And the burden of self-destruction is part of Russia's historical DNA of the last century and more, right? It is a society that was killing and hurting itself in civil war, totalitarian experiments, World War II, Gulag, widespread violence in armed forces and internal troops, in poverty, but probably, above all, in daily disregard for human life and human dignity. And this goes for the whole society, right? So facing the damage that was done to others means acknowledging the damage that was done to you. And this can be unbearable. And if a society is such that large chunks of its intelligentsia have, in order to simply keep going on emotionally, have to look the other way when dealing with abuse and rape of children, then it is, unfortunately, only natural that the majority of such society will easily look the other way when Russia is firing hundreds of rockets onto Ukrainian cities and sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers to kill, occupy, and torture. To be very clear, I've been to the territories that Ukraine liberated in 2022. I've seen the ungraspable destruction. I am not comparing the damage, but these modes of thinking are not unrelated.
What would you say to all the adults that failed to protect you from the abuse and failed to accept the consequences when you told them about what happened?
Well, at different stages of the last years, I would say different things. All right. Immediately when the crisis was unraveling, I would say I don't blame them for the wrong reason. I would honestly also think that, the situation is exceptional. We are in such social circumstances that I understand why they don't want to cause more harm by reporting people. Then for many years, I would tell them, well, you suck, because how on earth can you, adult human beings, say that things are complicated when you're dealing with the rape of children? Are you out of your mind? It is a crime comparable with manslaughter and murder, not robbery, not theft. It's very serious. It's one of the most serious crimes that exists on the penal code. Now, I probably feel honestly sorry for them. I do hope that what we did actually helped some of them to also come to terms with the violence that they themselves lived through. I don't have anything to tell them now.
I have never felt so objectified in my whole life as I did during the scandal. A man catcalling you on the street and checking out your butt is nothing compared to what intelligentsia did with their slovobludie. Slovobludie is a word in Russian, and I think literally it translates to word whoring, and that precisely describes what Russian intelligentsia was doing. I felt like I was enrolled in a highly unethical study, a la Tuskegee, the design of which included the rape of a semi-random subset of school-age children.
During the scandal, the brightest minds of Russian intelligentsia were discussing the impact such an event might have had on young and immature minds. While they were winning their prizes in, magniloquence and sophistication and God knows what else, I was completely stripped of humanity. No one ever asked me how I felt. No one ever asked me what I believe could have prevented it. No one ever asked me how I thought or felt about it, what actually happened in more details. And what saddens me the most is that even those people who said they're going to be reforming the school, even they never asked me. And those people now either still teach in Russia or they teach abroad, and they think that this is how you do shit. I will not pretend that moral bankruptcy of people I once respected was not painful. It hurt, and it hurts now, and it will probably hurt me in the future. I think it's just something about deep disappointment that stays on. But I'm also grateful because it allowed me to separate the good from the bad, to separate the people that I respect from people I do not wish to respect, to recognize people, Russian intelligentsia, snobbishness, narrow-mindedness, vanity, lack of morality, self-serving grandiloquence, something like that. And it allowed me to start weeding it out of myself because I was taught all of this since childhood. And I believe that I became a better person for that. I'm not proud of many decisions that I made when those people were my role models, and I'm glad I could break free and not grow up into them. I probably should feel sorry for you, adults who failed me, because in order to justify pedophilia, in order to blame and objectify the victims, and refuse to accept responsibility, you must be very sad and insecure and pathetic. But I do not feel any empathy. I think that empathy is a very limited resource, and in a world where people, animals, dogs, cats, humans are dying under bombs and where the whole cities are destroyed, I just don't have enough of it to spare for you. And because of that, I guess my main message is, I wish you to burn in hell.
Sergei Mendelevich resigned from his position as a principal a week after the accusations went public. And at the same time, the most unusual thing happened. Federal investigators in Russia began looking into the allegations described in the posts. Why do I call it unusual? Because, as I explained in the first episode, Russian authorities don't tend to take sexual violence cases seriously. But this was different. This was a well-known school attended by the kids of intelligentsia. Within a few weeks, investigators opened a criminal case against Boris Meerson and Masha Nemzer, the young school chaperone we heard about in the last episode. And that was also a surprise to me, because usually a preliminary investigation lasts for months or even years before a criminal case is opened. But not in this case, apparently.
So on September 1st, the Russian Investigative Committee announced a preliminary investigation into this, and they reached out to me. By that time, there was immense public pressure to reveal more truth. Mine and Rivka's posts were not seen as sufficient, and people kept saying, well, this is not enough. And the real, whatever they meant by this, the real way to proceed is through the investigation, which is cynical because none of those people would do that themselves. They all were from the circles. So it was basically a way to silence us yet again. I take full responsibility for my actions. I am not ashamed of them, but they were done in this context. So I decided to speak to the investigative office. I did not take any active steps on that way. I responded to their invitation, and I gave the testimony sometime in September via Skype and on the other And the fact that I did respond to an invitation of a Russian investigative office ostracized me even more. There were quite some people who told me, you went to Gestapo when we live in a ghetto. You did the impossible thing. How on earth did you dare to do this? Well, I can only say, look at the information shitstorm that you've created. And then Boris was placed on the federal wanted list in January 2017. And I think 5 days later, in January 2017, on January the 24th, he was ordered to be placed on international wanted list, specifically in Israel and all other states that are parties to the Interpol.
But Boris escaped justice.
Yes, Boris escaped justice.
More on the next episode. The Adults in the Room is produced by Libo Studio. All episodes are out now, so you can play the next one right away. This podcast has a website where you can find additional visual materials collected throughout our investigation and feedback contacts. The link is in the description box. This show is hosted, reported, and written by me, Nastya Krasivnikova. A huge thank you to my colleagues, researcher and fact-checker Vika Labanova, producers and editors Nastya Medvedeva, Sam Colbert, and Dasha Cherkudinova, composer and sound designer Ildar Fattahov, and the head of Libo, Lika Kremer. Legal support provided by Michael Svard and Alon Sapir from the Michael Svard Law Office, and Sergei Markov, managing partner of the law firm Markov and Manaminov. Thank you for listening.